Up next, Ron Paul, a Libertarian candidate for the presidency, is our guest on the Live Your Call-In program. Join us with your comments and questions.
Ron Paul, Libertarian Party candidate for president. When you see how much money the candidates from the major parties raise and how much press coverage they get, how frustrating does that get for you as a minority party candidate?
Well, it is a bit frustrating, but knowing that you're dealing with the correct ideas and a very popular philosophy, we can make up for it. But of course, it would be nice to have the money too. But we do have the edge. We're talking about a philosophy that truly has answers to some of the problems. So this certainly gives us a help.
How's the campaign going?
I think real well. I'm very pleased, and I wish we could take all the credit, but I have to give the Democrats and the Republicans some credit because they're doing such a lousy job. I think the American people are rather disgusted. Most people aren't Republicans or Democrats, so therefore when you offer them a new idea and a new party and new solutions to some of the nonsense they've been putting up with, they're more or less delighted. But the majority of the American people are fed up. They're not voting, and we just have to excite them enough to think about voting for something positive and vote Libertarian.
Is that the part of the campaign that you say pleases you, is the response you're getting when you speak out in the country?
I think so. The response is there. Working with young people, which we do a lot of, is very exciting. I think there's a tremendous opportunity. 1988 is a very unique year. The country is bankrupt. The Republicans and the Democrats have run it into the ground so bad. They're really up against the wall. They don't know what to do, and they can't balance the budget, and they have no solutions to offer. So to me, it's exciting. I think we're finally getting to the point of, and this was always my big frustration in the Congress, it was always, the debate was always how to use government, how to spend the money. Where the debate should be, should we be? Should we be using government for these programs? Should we be running a welfare state? Should we be telling the whole country and the whole world how to live and who should run other countries? So now I think we're getting the area where the proper debate ought to be is, should we be doing so many of these things that government pretends to be doing?
In discussing the other candidates, you've lumped the Republicans and the Democrats several times in your answers together. What's different about you from them?
Well, I think it's a basic philosophic difference. The Republicans and the Democrats use the same philosophy, and that is the use of government to serve special interests. Where Libertarians limit the role of government to the guaranteeing and protection of individual liberty. More along the lines of the classical liberals, along the lines of the Founding Fathers, along the lines of the Constitution. But it's a narrow view of government. Government should be very small. Government should have a precise purpose. It's the protection of individual liberty rather than running a welfare state and rather than running a military warfare state. Republicans and Democrats agree that government should be doing all these things. They only argue about who to support. Should we send the money to the Sandinistas? Should we send the money to the Contras? And they argue and fuss about the use of this funds. Should we give food stamps to the farmers or food stamps to the poor people rather than saying, should the government be in the welfare business at all?
Let me ask you a specific question. One of the things that the other candidates do to knock each other is they point to the other one and say, he wants to cut the budget, but he doesn't say where. He just speaks in generalities. So let me ask you, the economy is one of your big issues. Where in the budget would you specifically make cuts that these other candidates aren't addressing?
Well, I think my last year in Congress gives you an indication of where I would cut. I voted against 99% of the spending, which means I think it all needs cut. And the longer I was in Washington, the more convinced I was that there was waste in all areas of the budget, which means the welfare needs to be cut, but the military needs cut because a lot of the military expenditures does not go to defense of this country. For instance, the money we pay for the defense of Japan, why are we paying that? $40 billion a year or so that goes to Japan. Why do we pay for the defense of Europe, or a large portion of that? 65% of our military budget goes to defending other people. So we're saying, well, yes, let's have a strong defense, but let's do it wisely. Let's cut back. And we can't do it by more efficient purchasing. We have to do it only by changing philosophy. What should the role of government be? Should we be policing the world, or shouldn't we be? We argue that we shouldn't be. We should be providing for a strong national defense. For instance, those F-16s in Spain. They don't want them there. They don't want us there. They're kicking us out, and we want to be there. Of course, if we need to fly over their territory, they probably won't let us, but we're insisting we stay there. Well, I'd like to see the F-16s in our Air National Guard. Our own Air National Guard have airplanes that are 20 and 30 years old. So we would look at this differently, but we could do that and still save money.
Good evening once again, and welcome to this segment of this evening's call-ins. Our guest for the next 45 minutes, Ron Paul, the presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party. Invite your questions and comments. We know a lot of you will have questions. We'll be going to the phones in just a few moments. You'll see the phone numbers across the bottom of your screen throughout the program. We have our eastern lines are full, but there are several lines open in the mountain and western time zones, so we invite you to call. If the phone line rings, stay on the line. Your call will be answered in turn. If it's busy, call back and try again. One of the releases that's put out by the Libertarian Party says that only 15 states allow people to register as libertarians. Why is that it's so few?
Well, I think it's a very deliberate attempt to keep the competition out. You know, in some states where we have made inroads, they've deliberately made it more difficult to get on the ballot. So I don't think they can stand the heat of the competition. And since they represent one philosophy, at the state legislative level, the Republicans and the Democrats get together and say, look, whatever we can to obstruct any competition, we're going to do it. And it's rather undemocratic on the way, you know, alternative parties are treated.
How'd the party do in the last election?
Well, the party in the last election had several 100,000 votes. So in terms of percentages, it's a small percentage. In terms of growth in philosophy and the spreading of the message and the impact that libertarianism is having, I think it's tremendous. For instance, this recent study that came out on privatization, that's strictly a libertarian approach to the problem. So we're having a tremendous impact. And I happen to believe 1988 is a tremendous opportunity for libertarians because the Reagan era is over. The popular Ronald Reagan is now leaving, and besides, he's not so popular as he used to be, and we can see what kind of deficits have been run up. So we have this tremendous opportunity for growth. So although we can't say in 1984 we had this tremendous expansion, we're believing that 1988 is a tremendous opportunity for us, and we think the American people are going to respond favorably toward the libertarian message.
Our first call for Ron Paul from Roswell, Georgia. Good evening.
Well, I like to say one thing. He favored Abraham Lincoln a little bit. I think he's a little better looking. And I think he'd make a nice president. I don't like whoever's running today. I'd like to ask him about something. How can a foreign country, like a lobby from a foreign country, like from Israel, run the United States like they do today, and then turn around with our money and our weapons and murder teenagers, the ones that live like slaves in their own country, and then get by with it? That's what I'd like to know. And how do you register as a libertarian if you be a Democrat? Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Well, the registration isn't difficult. You have to do it through your local board, but some states won't let you. And if they won't let you, you get hold of your people who represent you at the state legislative level and demand that you have the opportunity to register as a libertarian. But I think your point is very well taken about the power of a lobby in Washington that everybody is fearful and very intimidated by, and of course that's the lobby that represents the state of Israel. And our position is neither pro-Israel nor anti-Israel. It happens to be very neutral. But by becoming neutral and being against all foreign aid, it just happens that Israel receives the bulk of it, at least more than 50% of all the foreign aid. So therefore, we would remove that. This would restore balance to the Middle East, and I think it would eliminate our terrorist problems. We have Americans taken as hostages mainly because of the tremendous resentment toward Americans for our Mideast policy. So we would very much in favor getting back to a more sensible, neutral position. But it's your member of Congress that has permitted this. Most members of Congress are very intimidated, and it's sad because and even as I speak here, I'm quite aware of this. If you say anything, I, as well as others, will be said, oh, you're anti-Semitic, and this is the reason you're doing this. And that people are fearful, and nobody wants to be anti-Semitic. But we can be pro-American and we can be neutral, and therefore we can argue that we ought not to send any money to any other foreign nation. We argue that the American people deserve to keep the money. We believe in American aid. We believe you have the right to get a job and the right to keep what you earn, but not for me as a politician to tax you and send it to some country. Who knows? Somebody might support communism with it. Somebody might support Israel. Somebody might support South Africa. I would argue that the best thing to do is support American taxpayers.
West Hills, California, you're on C-SPAN.
Hi. In 1988, the first year I'd be able to vote for president, and I was wondering what Mr. Paul thought of the Grace Commission report on how to cut deficit, and also his views on social issues like abortion and school or prayer in school. Thank you.
Okay, the Grace Commission report has a net benefit to us. It points out the waste and inefficiency of government. But there's a lot more to it than that. It's also policy. Government will always be wasteful and inefficient, so therefore you have to argue for the least amount of government. The Grace Commission on a few occasions indicated that they would like to see some things privatized. Now that's the important thing, change in philosophy. But unless we change our foreign policy, unless we change our attitude toward welfare, you cannot make government more efficient. Some people say, thank goodness government doesn't accomplish everything it intends to, that it is inefficient because it would be so intrusive into our lives. But we would have to work more on changing policy than just saying that the Grace Commission could solve our problems. That's the only thing I fault with the Grace Commission. It doesn't deal enough in philosophy, but more with the efficiency of government. On the social issues, on prayer in school, we as libertarians would like to do anything we could to solve that problem. And the real solution is to give the monopoly public school system some competition. And that is, if you don't like the way your public schools are being run, if they're not saying enough prayers or reading enough of the Bible, then you have the chance to take your kids out of school, use a voucher or get a tax credit and get them into a private school and cause some competition. As a libertarian within a society with a school system that we're not going to change overnight, I would argue that there should be no compulsions and no prohibitions. Nobody should be compelled to say a prayer, but certainly there shouldn't be a court ruling that says that you can't even have a moment of silence of prayer for a voluntary prayer. That to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Libertarians take the position and take a pledge and say that we will never initiate force or aggression against another individual. This means you can't hurt anybody, you can't steal from anybody, and you can't kill anybody and injure another man's property. My interpretation is that the fetus is a human being, it's alive and deserves protection of the law. So therefore, I'm on the side of the right to life issue, claiming the fetus is a legal entity. I know as a physician, if I injure the fetus can sue me for the injury. Therefore, I believe the fetus deserves the protection of the law.
Now to your home state, Dallas, Texas. Good evening.
Hi, Ron. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm really glad to get you on the line. First of all, you know, as to this issue about no coverage for the libertarians, in fact, if you look around, there really is only one political party in this country, and some have called it the Demopublicans. And I'm sure that you probably hold the same feeling that they're in control. And as long as they're in control, buddy, you don't have a chance. Unless, of course, you know, you're just a hard charger, but be that as it may. One thing I wanted to ask, how do you intend to practically go about dismantling big government? It's one thing for you to say, and I agree with you, it needs to be changed, but how in the world are you going to fight the Demopublican Congress?
Well, there's a limit what I can do. I don't think anything changes unless you change people's ideas and attitudes, and I think that's where our tremendous growth has been in the formation and the expansion of libertarian views in the last 15 or 20 years. So that's where we should be encouraged. There are more students coming out of universities now who have libertarian views. There's more representation. But I, as a single individual, can't do anything other than the little bit that I can contribute by educating and explaining. I served 4 terms in the U.S. Congress, voted a precise position, tried to present these views, and hopefully invited other people into understanding the libertarian message. But nothing will change until we change the philosophic attitude, and of course I think that's where we can see some changes. But you know, one practical argument about this, let's say even under today's circumstances, the worst of circumstances, if we had a libertarian president can achieve a lot more than you might think. The libertarian is the only one that offers a reasonable solution, a reasonable compromise to this horrible budgetary process. For instance, today, the only argument is how to spend money at government, and they always compromise, and they get together, and the conservatives compromise with the liberals, and they raise both. The libertarian can go to the conservative and say, look, don't you think we ought to cut some of this welfare? The conservatives will support those vetoes. I can go to the liberals and say, don't you think we spend too much in the military? And they would agree. So I think the libertarian is the only one can offer a compromise and a practical solution to the budgetary process that we have right now, the problems we have now.
Longview, Texas, you're on C-SPAN with Ron Paul.
Thank you. One of the questions I was going to ask you about, you were talking about foreign aid and how you're going to cut it, the percentage that was going to protect overseas countries. Called before kind of answered that when he called it. The other one, a couple more questions I'd like to ask you about was, I've heard the Libertarian Party was in favor of totally opening up the borders down south and just kind of have free passage between the borders, and I'd kind of like to know your thoughts on that. And the other one I'd like to know is what your thoughts would be on the latest civil rights bill that's just passed. No, hang on, thank you.
Okay, let's work backwards on the civil rights bill. That was misnamed. That was a violation of civil rights. It was a violation of the property rights of Grove City. That's the college it was directed against. It meant the government can come in and in a preemptive way regulate private colleges and the way they run colleges. So I would say that it was the worst kind of civil rights bill because it had nothing to do with civil rights. It was an intrusion bill because in a free society, in a libertarian society, voluntarism solves all these problems. People can come to a college and do what they want. If they don't like it, they can leave. There was never any proof that this particular college ever discriminated against anybody. It had to do with the fact that they didn't take any government money. They didn't want to fill out the government forms, and the government said, we will make you fill out the government forms. It had to do with authority and authoritarian approach to the control of private schools, and therefore it was exactly the opposite of a civil rights bill. His other question...
About open borders.
Open borders. It's a more difficult question because under today's circumstances, people see open borders as a very sincere threat to the economy and to the welfare system because some aliens can come in and be unburdened. In a free society, open borders are very, very good. Just think about how the so-called open borders, which have essentially been open in Canada, people come back and forth all the time and work on both sides and they go back and forth. It's not a major problem. People are more concerned because of the government in Mexico and some of the aliens coming up, and I think there's a little bit of racism involved here as well. But in a free society, you're always short labor. So people who come up actually give us a service. At the same time, this is the best foreign aid you can think of. People come up and they work, they take the money back and they help those families. Instead of what we're doing, we tax our people, then we give the money to the governments like Mexico, and then they rip off the system and they take it and the people never get the money. So it's the opposite of a socialist approach to helping other people. Actually, aliens are a net benefit under today's circumstances. Those who are concerned about aliens coming over, I can understand the concern, but that would not be the case in a libertarian society.
We have about a half hour left in our discussion this evening with Ron Paul, the Libertarian candidate for president. He's been running for that office since February 16th of last year. He was a member of Congress for 4 terms, a Republican from Houston, Texas, a member of the Banking Committee when he was in the House. He served as the House sponsor of the U.S. Gold Commission and is co-author of its minority report called The Case for Gold, founder of the Council for Monetary Reform, chairman of the Committee to Abolish the Fed, editor and publisher of the Ron Paul Investment Letter, and is a practicing physician. His BA is from Gettysburg College, his MD from Duke University Medical School. He's originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our next call is from St. Louis. Good evening.
Mr. Paul, I'd like to vote Libertarian this fall, but I have a reservation. The Republicans take my tax money and waste it on excess military spending and fighting victimless crimes. But at least they vote against things such as the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which I consider to be the Big Brother Installation Act. And at least they're trying to keep government out of my life somewhat. And I'm at the point now where I don't think I can even afford to run my business anymore if the government is going to make me fill out any more forms or get any further into my hiring practices. What if the Democrats get in November? I'm afraid of that. Don't you think that a vote for Republican might really help that situation?
Well, voting Republican last time, it didn't help because the veto was overridden, so it didn't do you any good. I think you're wasting your vote if you vote Republican or Democrat, and I used to vote Republican, and I've come to the conclusion that support for Ronald Reagan for balancing the budget and cutting back was totally worthless. Actually, the spending got worse under Ronald Reagan. The deficit skyrocketed, so it doesn't work. Conservatives are at their worst when they have a Republican conservative president. So you could argue that you should vote Democrat and not Republican, because Democrats at times can protect your personal civil liberties a little bit better than Republicans, and they're more likely to vote against some of the wasteful spending overseas. And what we're saying is nothing ever changes. Policies remain the same. The rhetoric is somewhat different, but you're wasting your vote if you keep voting Republican and Democrat. What we need to do as an American people is send the people in Washington, the Republicans and the Democratic leadership, a message and tell them we're tired of it all, that there's something better. And therefore, I think that it's time we quit wasting our vote and decide to vote for something, and vote for freedom, vote for the Libertarian Party.
Honolulu, good evening.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to ask Ron how he would abolish the IRS, and also how would we be less dependent on oil if there's, some program that he could implement where we'd be less dependent on outside foreign oil.
Well, the market solves the problem of oil. Actually, there was a shortage of oil when we regulated the price of oil under Jimmy Carter. And that was one of the good things of the Reagan administration. They deregulated the price of oil. Now we have a glut and the price has crashed. So the market can take care of it. The market can solve the problem, which is the most efficient use of energy. Well, you abolish, the best way to abolish the income tax, of course, is to get the Congress to go along with it and pass a law and just remove it. I think that if I had the right and the ability to do it with a presidential order and did it the first day in office, I could bring the rest of the government to a halt, because if they don't have the strong-arm tactics of the IRS to stick a gun at us and say, you will pay, then the rest of the government has to dry up. But a lot of people get worried about, well, if you don't have an income tax, what's going to happen to the government? Well, we didn't have an income tax before 1913. We survived. New Hampshire doesn't have an income tax nor a sales tax, and they're surviving quite well with a 3% unemployment rate. If you take this $1 trillion monster of a budget for next fiscal year, you will find out that 38% of it is covered by the personal income tax. So I would say that we ought to cut spending by that much, get rid of the income tax, and get back to a sensible government. The abuse of the IRS on the American people today is about 10 times, if not 100 times worse than what the king imposed on our grandparents back in colonial days. The IRS can come and tell us that we owe so much money, we're guilty until proven innocent. They confiscate our property without due process of law. They compel us to keep records. They make us incriminate ourselves. And the American people just sit back complacently and say, oh, well, I guess that's the way it has to be. It doesn't have to be that way. We need to do something about it. We don't need the income tax, and we ought to get rid of it.
Richardson, Texas, good evening.
Good evening. I want to compliment you on having such a distinguished guest this evening, and I'm looking forward to hear Ron Paul speak. American Liberty Association get together in Richardson soon. I'd like to ask Mr. Paul about his stance on the Federal Reserve. I understand that he opposes the Federal Reserve and proposes to see it abolished, and I'd like to have him expound on that, and also find out a little bit more about the new money that he spoke about in the past.
Well, there's essentially nothing new on the new money. There was a proposal several years back that the Federal Reserve and Treasury admitted to, that they were planning to change the color of the money. Usually when a government changes the appearance of the money, it's for the purpose of driving out the underground economy, because there's a cash economy, and a lot of people naively believe if you just drove that economy out into the open, they could collect enough taxes to balance the budget, not realizing that people don't produce as well when they have to fill out the forms and pay the taxes. And besides, why wreck the underground economy? There's a 100% employment rate in the underground economy. It's really a tremendous benefit to the economy. I'd like to just legalize it. The Federal Reserve System needs to go. It came into existence in 1913 along with the income tax, and it's a form of taxation. It has given the legal monopoly to a very powerful institution, the Federal Reserve, to control the most important commodity in the whole economy, and that's the money commodity. If we have legalized counterfeiting, we have allowed the politicians to spend the money, run up the deficits, send the bills to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve prints the money and creates the credit. It is an insane monetary system. It won't work. It's going to collapse. The stock market has already collapsed. The dollar is worth about a nickel on a dollar compared to 1945, and it's going to go a lot lower. So if we want a sensible economy, if we want to get rid of the business cycle, if we want full employment, believe me, you'll never have that until you get rid of the Federal Reserve System. We have to have sound money. We have to have a back currency. We have to have a gold standard, and take away from the politicians the power to create money out of thin air. When that happens, you'll see reasonable government and you will see a healthy economy.
Boulder, Montana, you're on with Ron Paul.
Yes, sir. Hello, Mr. Paul.
there's one thing I'd like to clarify there for you, and this is on the oil. I worked in the oil industry for 21 years. There was never any shortage of oil. There's not any shortage today, and there'll never be in the United States. They drill in wells the same as they was doing back when we were supposed to have shortage. And they're capping them off, and we have nobody in the energy department that looks at the oil company, that checks on the oil company. They go out and they put down some of these wells. They'll spend $1 million, $2 million putting them down. They write them off as dry holes. Under legislation through our federal government, the federal government with taxpayers' money pays 50% of the drilling fee. Okay, I was with Mobil, and I worked for Exxon, and I worked for Conoco. And they go out into the fields, and they shut these wells down. When they shut the wells down, they tap them off as being on regeneration, the oil recollecting in the bottom of the cavity. They get $300 a day. The oil companies, they went into Saudi Arabia, to OPEC, American oil companies put those oil wells in.
Boulder, Montana, I'm going to let you go on that point. We've got a lot of calls, and we'll let the congressman respond.
Okay, I think it's a little bit inaccurate to say the taxpayer pays for drilling these wells. If they get a tax credit and get some of their own money back, that's not a cost to government. That just means if somebody wants to spend $1 million taking a gamble, I wouldn't give him 50% back. I'd give him the whole thing off. Let him take the gamble because he's going to make the profits, but he deserves to lose the money. But that's not a cost to government. That's assuming the government owns everything that we produce. So the government doesn't literally pay for drilling oil wells. But I would still argue the marketplace can provide and solve these problems, not perfectly, but so much better than government. So when we had more regulation, we had less energy and it cost a lot more. When we had less regulation, we had a tremendous abundance. Yes, he points out some very serious problems, the capping off of wells, mainly because of the regulation and the inflation fooled a lot of businessmen, fooled even very wealthy people in Texas who have lost a lot of money. But that is part of the misinformation we get from an inflated dollar, where people thought the oil price was going to go to $40 a barrel and it crashed down to $15 a barrel. That's part of the monetary system's contribution to this confusion. But a free market and sound money, people allowed to take risks, believe me, we would not have an energy shortage.
Our phone lines continue to be full. If you're on the line and it's ringing, stay with us. Your call will be answered in turn. Our next call again from Dallas. Good evening.
Ron, I want to congratulate you for having the courage to sponsor such legislation as abolishing the Federal Reserve and also abolishing the Internal Revenue Service. The author, Eustace Mullins, he's the author of Secrets of the Federal Reserve and the World Order, would concur with you. But further, I'd like for you to comment on the background of Vice President George Bush and his membership in the secret society called Skull and Bones.
Well, all I can say is, you know, people have written about this, and the Skull and Bones is a secret order of Yale, and the proposition is that people are there groomed for the Trilateral Commission and the CFR, and therefore they will then be in positions of great influence in our government. And I think that's safe to say, and I think they'd admit it too, those members who belong, because I think they're very proud of it. There's nothing very secret about it, and whether or not you have a Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, the key appointments, whether they're at the Federal Reserve or State Department or Treasury Department, wherever, they come from this elite group of people who serves the northeastern establishment in the banking community.
Modesto, California. You're on C-SPAN.
Hi. I have 3 short questions, and I'll ask them and then hang up and take the answer on the air. I was wondering, what would a libertarian government do regarding the homeless and poverty? What would libertarians do about the confusion between license and freedom in the business class? And what is the libertarian perception of civil rights? Thank you.
Well, on civil rights, it's very clear. Everybody has a right to their life and a right to their property, and they don't have a right to be told how to live. Government can't make an individual a better person by regulating his lifestyle, so he's allowed to do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't hurt anybody else. We would do a lot about the homeless and the poverty. Matter of fact, It is because of my deep concern for the many people in poverty today that makes me a libertarian. I am firmly convinced, and the evidence is overwhelming and in great abundance to show the more government you have, the more poverty you have. The more socialism you have, the more Marxism and more fascism you have, the more problems you have. Even in our system of government, which is called interventionism, the planned society, we have a lot of poverty. So after 50 years of welfare, after 50 years or so of building houses and taking care of the sick, we have more people who are homeless and more people who do not have medical care and more people who are poor than ever before. If we took all the money that went to Washington to serve the welfare state, we could pass out $45,000 per poor family. And yet the poor people don't get anything. The bureaucrats get the money, and all the people passing out the money, the people get to build the homes, and the bankers and whoever get the money, but the poor people very rarely get the help. Actually, welfare is a sham and it's a fraud. It's to deceive the poor people in order for them to endorse big government, so the welfare of big corporations and bankers are served at the expense of the middle class.
Princeton, New Jersey, good evening.
Hello, Mr. Paul. I just wanted to ask you, what would you do about Soviet expansionism around the world, being that you're mentioning that we should cut back on the spending of our money in defense, giving some $40 billion to defend Japan and the money that we spend in Europe and around the world. How would you prevent the U.S. from becoming isolationist and preventing the Soviets from trying to expand their influence around the world?
Okay, you do three things. The number one thing you do is you quit financing them. There's no reason for us to be sending good discounted loans and extend credit to the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc nation. We're getting ready to send even more. We signed this IMF treaty. We're trusting the Soviets with the number of missiles we have, and now we're planning to even expand our loans to the Soviet Union. The next thing we ought to do is straighten up the State Department. We ought to shrink the State Department and certainly get rid of all the people in the State Department who are left-leaning and supportive of left-wing regimes. The most important thing we do is we change our policy. It is our policy that creates the fertile field for communism to grow. Out of our good intentions, we as a nation under Republican and Democratic administration have been sending billions of dollars to a guy like Marcos in the Philippines. What did Marcos do? He stole the money, ripped off the people. We put on tariffs on their sugar. The people became impoverished, and what happened? The communist movement became strong. We used to support Somoza. The Sandinistas got strong and they took over. We used to support Batista. The communist movement got strong and they took over Cuba. So what I am arguing is that our very policy that is intended to be tough against communism is literally the problem, because we can see many examples, such as in Nigeria, when we stayed out, they became more pro-American and more anti-communist. So in a practical argument, the policy doesn't work. Besides, we're broke and we can't afford it anyway. It would be much better that we spend our money on our national defense rather than bankrupting ourselves by supplying wealth and funds for the defense of Japan. They can pay their own way.
We have about 15 minutes left with Ron Paul, the Libertarian Party candidate for president, San Jose, California. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you? Yes, Mr. Paul, I have a question for you. I'm a working colleague with one of the upper officials of the Libertarian Party here in the area. And we've had a discussion many times about this subject, and they seem to agree on most points. However, one of the points I'm worried about is that the view of the Libertarian Party about big business and unrestrained business. It seems to me that if large business goes unrestrained, as far as monopoly, as far as labor laws, things like that, they're able to do anything they want to. It seems to me a very large, aggressive company could eventually become the government itself. What are your feelings about that?
Well, I think we should be concerned about monopolies. And I think that's why we ought to all be libertarians, because the libertarians reject the notion of monopolies, because all monopolies depend on government support. There's no such thing really as a free market monopoly. As long as there's free entry, as long as people never defraud nor injure another man's property nor break their contracts, you can't have a monopoly. The monopolies are created by government rules and regulations and benefits. Big corporations like Chrysler can be bailed out. If you're small, you have no advantage to go to Washington and get a special benefit. The big business corporations benefit by the foreign policy and our foreign aid and our military expenditures. They all benefit. So if you really want to do away with monopolies, what you have to go is for the free market. Now, does that mean a corporation might not get big? No, it might get big. But it would have to be big for only one reason, not because there would be any laws that would serve the interests of business, nor a law that would serve the interests of labor, but because the free market serves the interest of the consumer. The consumer is king in the free market. The consumer decides all prices and which businesses will exist and which ones will fail. Under those circumstances, you really can't have any monopolies.
Crandon, Wisconsin. Good evening.
Hello, this is Jim Larson speaking to you, sir, out of Crandon, Wisconsin. Now, I had a thriving business near Alice Chalmers, which are tractors now are made in Germany, West Germany, of course. Most of your Ford products are made in Mexico, and only God knows where everything else is being made. But there's sure nothing made in the United States of America. I'm 47 at the time, and I've begged for work. I live in a city where all they do is hire women at minimum wage. They care less about men that have worked and paid taxes all their life. It's just like we're obsolete. I was wondering if there's any kind of response I can get from this.
Yes. You are a victim. You are an early victim because there are going to be a lot more victims. You are a middle-class American citizen who's being wiped out. And every year there are going to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, mainly because we're following a policy of folly. A policy which is interventionist, one that endorses expenditures for anything and everything. We run up the deficits. We have this funny money system. We have this tax system that hinders our corporations and hinders the individual. Our interest rates are twice as high as they are in Japan. At the same time, we're subsidizing Japan. Makes it very difficult for our corporations to compete. The regulations make it very difficult for them to compete. So if we want to really help our government, our corporations and our businesses to be competitive, we have to change the system of government intervention. We have to reject the notions of the Republicans and Democrats and say there is a better way. We can have sound money. We can have interest rates at 3%. We can get rid of the taxes. And can you see the difference if we just got the burden of taxes off our people and quit subsidizing Japan? Maybe right then we could be a little bit more competitive. There's no reason. We don't need protectionism. We don't need handouts. All we need is a fair shake. And a fair shake means let's get the government off our back.
Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, I wanted to find out from you how you felt about the legislation that was passed yesterday. Frankly, it scared the heck out of me. Thanks.
Well, caller, wait a minute. Are you still with us?
Yeah.
Which bill are you referring to specifically?
The civil rights bill that was passed, the one that the moral majority was complaining about.
Okay, thanks for the call.
We answered that earlier, but I'll briefly go over it again. I think that to call that a civil rights bill is part of 1984 Newspeak. Had nothing to do with civil rights. It had to do with bureaucratic intrusion in the rights of a private college. A private college, even though they were receiving no funds, this is Grove City, they refused to fill out government forms. This was the heavy hand of government coming down on a private institution and saying, you will fill out the forms and we will control you and control your university. I was positively opposed to that bill.
West Monroe, Louisiana. You're on C-SPAN.
Hi, Mr. Paul. First of all, I would like to know where I can get some more information about the Libertarian Party. This is the first time I've ever listened to C-SPAN, and I'm very interested in everything you've had to say. Second, I'd like to know how you feel about the insurance companies in America today, and I'd like to know what you would do, if anything, to change them.
Well, that's a very broad question. All I can say is about the insurance business, I would treat them like any other business. It has to be handled by the free market. Matter of fact, the insurance companies are vital in a free market because instead of a government regulatory body, what you have is an insurance company. They don't issue insurance unless they're willing to assume the liability of so many things. So I think there's a lot of problems there, but it's a reflection of big government and government intervention. Now, if anybody wants to write and find out more about the campaign and the Libertarian Party, I have a real easy box number to remember. It's Box 1776 in Lake Jackson, Texas. Box 1776, Lake Jackson, Texas, and I'll get it.
I'd like to remind our viewers at the end of many of our call-in programs, when we have time for it, the address of the person who's on our program will be on. So at the end of this program, coming up in about 5 or 6 minutes, you'll be able to see that address again. Our next call from San Angelo, Texas. Good evening.
Yes, I want to ask Mr. Paul if he has some kind of strategy to stop these companies from taking all the jobs overseas. And I want to ask him another question. He's been talking about all these other foreign countries that United States been giving money to and giving funds to. What about Israel? You haven't said anything about Israel. We've been supporting Israel to the tune of millions of dollars a year.
Well,
those are my two questions. I hang up and listen to it.
Thank you.
Well, we have, and but I'll repeat it. The first question we had this evening was on Israel, and the Libertarian position is very clear. We wouldn't send a nickel to Israel, but we wouldn't send a nickel to the Arabs either. We are neutral when it comes to battles, especially battles that have been going on for thousands of years. We think our imposition of our position over there is actually part of the problem. So we would become neutral. It's just that Israel would suffer more by getting rid of all foreign aid because they receive the largest amount. The question about how do we get these jobs, to say here, the answer is very general, and that is that we allow our business people to become competitive again. We lower their taxes, we get rid of their regulations, we give them a sound monetary system, we give them lower interest rates, and we get rid of the labor laws which have outpriced our labor compared to what is in other countries. But we do not have to write a law and says that a businessman has to keep his business here. What we have to do is take care of the general welfare, the general environment, and make sure that the businessman can compete. There's no reason in the world why American business people can't compete, say, with the Koreans. That is an insult to me to think that we can't do it. The real reason is that government is so big and intrusive that we put so many roadblocks in front of our people that it makes it very difficult, and therefore our business people do the logical thing. They have to survive, so they go out of the country in order to survive to make a profit.
Before we run out of time, just to clear up a little confusion, the address that we superimposed a while ago when you gave your address was an address in Houston on NASA Boulevard,
That'll be fine, too. If that's written, that one is fine, too. But I thought it was only going to be verbal, and that was 1776 was an easy one to remember. But either one is okay.
So the address in Houston will still get to you?
The address in Houston is fine.
And that'll be coming up at the end of the program. Alexandria, Louisiana, good evening.
Yes, I just tuned in. I'm not sure if you talked about this already, but I'm stationed in Alexandria, Louisiana. I'm in the Air Force and England Air Force Base, and I was wondering your viewpoint on the support of Honduras by Ronald Reagan.
Okay, I am a former member of the Air Force. I served 5 years in the Air Force, and I think that the armed services deserve close attention. But I don't think they should have close attention by sending the Air Force to Honduras. Ortega is not a threat to our national security. If he is a threat to our national security, Congress should decide. That's what the Constitution says. Then we should do whatever is necessary. I don't happen to believe that is the case. I think we have a problem in Central America, mainly because we helped create it, because we supported Somoza for so many years and literally set the stage for a communist takeover. So we would like to do a lot less, a lot sooner, and get out of there. They're not, Nicaragua is not threatening Costa Rica. Costa Rica doesn't even have a government. I mean, doesn't even have an army. So therefore, we don't need to be down there to provide national security. But we could have a stronger national defense by, say, for instance, bringing those F-16s home from Spain and putting in our Air National Guard and for the units that are stationed in this country, but not to send them to Central America.
Our next call is from Los Angeles. Los Angeles, we just have about 1 minute left, so I'll ask for a quick question if you got one.
Well, I'll ask two. We can answer either one.
Okay.
Libertarian views on Social Security and smoking policy.
Smoking policy?
Yes.
Social Security, we would like to privatize it, get the people a chance to have something sound and not participate in a Ponzi scheme. That Social Security system is unworkable and it's going to collapse. The tax has been doubled during the Reagan administration. Smoking policy, private property rights should decide this. If you own your house or your store or your restaurant, you can decide. If you own your airline, you should decide, not the government. But you don't have the right to violate another man's property or his air by blowing smoke in his face.
As the campaign continues, the candidates of the major parties are now battling for delegates to their respective conventions. What are your plans over the next several months?
To continue to do what we're doing, campaigning, getting on radio shows, and getting as many interviews as possible, meeting as many people as possible, raise as much money as possible, and then ask the American people to demand that I get on the debates in the fall. That's the only way I'll get there, is the American people, the public opinion, have to insist that these views deserve to be aired. I believe they deserve to be aired when the major debates occur in the fall.
Our guest for the past 45 minutes, Ron Paul, the Libertarian Party candidate for president. We'd like to thank him once again for being with us and thank our viewers for their questions and their comments. Have a good evening.